Hi, I'm Wes, the Explosion, and this is the Backlog. Sometimes I question why I play video games, because weeks like this sure do make it clear it's not for fun. So I played Cyber Shadow by Mechanical Head Studios and published by Yacht Club Games, the latter being the people who made Shovel Knight, which is why I thought this would be excellent and fun. In it, you play as Shadow, a ninja who died but was put into a robot body. It seems that all the ninjas have died, but their ninja essence has been put into machines to give them their abilities or something. Honestly, I found it a little obtuse and hard to follow before I got fed up with this game and stopped paying attention. As Shadow, you run and jump about, swinging your sword. As you progress, you get new abilities, most of which require a bit of your skill gauge to use. You can upgrade this gauge and your health by exploring to find power-ups. This is one of those NES-style games, many comparing it to Ninja Gaiden. There are 11 levels, with checkpoints scattered throughout. You'll make a lot of use of these, as you'll be dying a ton. I'm normally okay with this sort of game, liking a challenge, but for several reasons, I absolutely hate it here. First off, the checkpoints feel spread apart further than they really should be. For the first few stages, it seems appropriate, and I felt like I was being fairly challenged. Then, I'd say around stage 4, things got to the point where I was no longer having a good time, and many sections felt like I was bashing my head against the wall until I saw a crack and managed to tumble through. Part of this was how deceptive your health bar is. I think I ended with about 12 units of health, but the average attack does 2 damage, a few early enemies only doing 1 and some of the nastier bosses doing 3. This means you die a lot faster than you'd think, and with all the things that get thrown on the screen at once, I at least have a hard time keeping track of the bar along with everything else. And did I mention all the things on screen? The game will throw a ton of enemies and projectiles at you at once, it oftentimes feeling like there are more hurtful parts of the screen than safe places. Several of the enemies are also obnoxious. Some will float just out of reach and shoot projectiles at you. Others will fire off attacks with no room to counter. The best way to deal with these are normally your shuriken, but given that these require skill points to use and you can run out, you can very easily be left in a pretty crappy position and have to just brute force some foes. This is especially frustrating given that your invincibility frames are non-existent, so that one hit you take could easily combo into multiple blows, chewing through your already inadequate health bar. On top of all that, sometimes you just die. Pits and spikes are one-hits, as you can imagine, and sometimes, when traversing a stage, an enemy you had no idea existed can just fly in from off-screen, hit you in the middle of a jump or just by the edge of a platform, and you'll just die. This can lead to a section where you have to do some tricky jumps, take out a handful of enemies, carefully navigate a series of security lasers to avoid setting off turrets and a spinning blade that will follow you, jump over some pits, take out some more enemies, do some precision platforming, only to get knocked off by an unannounced enemy and fall to your death. This is not fair. The argument could be made that it's up to the players to learn a segment and only let them progress once they have it memorized, but the sections are too long to justify this. It feels akin to completing one of those obstacle courses you see on TV, like Ninja Warrior, struggling to get through without a single mess up, only to have somebody kick you in the nuts right before you cross the finish line and tell you to do it all again. It was incredibly hard to get that far. Requiring a repeat just because you didn't have precognition is incredibly unfair. On top of that, there are even more issues. The game can be very inconsistent with how things work. One example is, there's this one attack that kinda works like Link's Pogo in Smash, just flashier and more dramatic. This lets you strike things underneath you. At one point, there was a pair of enemies creeping along the floor on the platform beneath me. The first time I used it, I killed both. The second time, I took damage. The third, I did damage, but still needed to hit them again to finish them off. Then there was the final boss, which had 3 stages. Sometimes, healths dropped between forms, but when I looked it up, no one seemed to know why. Some bosses also give you an upgrade to your health when you win, but which ones did and did not gave no clear indication. It could be random, it could be set bosses, or it could be based on performance. I just don't know. The last one would particularly bother me if true though, because while I normally like rewards for good plays, here it would feel like giving better players a means of making the game easier while punishing those already having trouble with a harder time. Another problem are just the controls. You have a directional input and 2 buttons. One button jumps, the other attacks. For your other moves, you have to use one of the other buttons and a directional input. I am playing this on a Pro controller. Not counting the pause and menu ones, that means I have 4 main buttons and 4 shoulders. There is no reason I shouldn't be able to map some of the other functions to the other buttons. Except this is supposed to be like a Nintendo game, which only had 2 buttons, minus pause and select. I'm guessing they wanted an authentic NES experience, which is why they did it like that. Only this reason doesn't hold up. For starters, the NES can only have so many things on screen at once before you start seeing major performance issues. If you play the original Mega Man, you get 3 adhering Suzes on screen at once, and things start to slow down. You get 4, and the game goes into extreme slow motion. Beyond that, your console would likely explode. If this were an NES, there would be no way that the system would be able to handle around a dozen enemies and projectiles at once. In addition to that, you can despawn most enemies on NES and Super NES by tricking them into going off screen. Some of these erratic enemies should be disappearing once they travel out of bounds, and you shouldn't have to keep track of things outside of your field of view. If you want to make an optimized NES experience on a modern console to add an extra challenge that wasn't possible on the days of old, the very least you can do is add in the modern convenience of more than 2 damn buttons. It just does not feel as fluid using the directional input as just a single button press would be. You did this on fucking purpose to maintain your classic vision that was compromised from the get-go with the extra shit you were already throwing our way. End of day, I just really hate this game. I ended on 330 deaths, but if you had asked me to estimate how many times I died, I would have put it at over 1,000. This game was purgatory. When it comes to challenge games like this, there are 3 types in my opinion. The first is tough but fair. I would put Cuphead and Celeste in this category, and I love both dearly. Then there are troll games like Ares Action, which is upfront about what it's going to pull, and since you're aware of the bullcrap, you can keep your eye out and try to predict it. In a way, it becomes almost like a puzzle game as you try and figure out what shenanigans it's gonna pull next. Then there are the just unfair ones. Some are just incompetently designed, but this feels very purposeful and mean-spirited. The checkpoints are too far apart. Some attacks become unavoidable depending on how some elements spawn in together. You get attacked by things you have no way to know exist. A single mistake can completely tank an otherwise perfect run. It's just plain not fun. I understand what the developers were trying to pull off here, but in my opinion, they largely failed. You know what game did have a retro feel? You played as a ninja, and had a good level of challenge? The Messenger. Sure, that one had SNES graphics, and instead of a sci-fi, it had more of a fantasy setting, complete with time travel, but you were still a guy with a sword, running around, slashing things while jumping off walls. There was even one point in Cyber Shadow where the game encourages you to bounce off things with your downward aerial attack to stay constantly airborne, and I thought back to how you could actually do that in the Messenger, it actually working as advertised in that game. I think there were times when I spent over a minute in the air, traveling from one end of the screen to another without touching the ground. The controls were just so fluid and it felt so good to use. Plus, unlike this game, which is just made a bitch from one end to the other, the Messenger, while challenging throughout, did ramp things up at an appropriate pace, allowing the player to learn to use the tools they were given to become truly skilled by the end of the game. There was one point where I was pulling off crazy moves that I could not even begin to explain. My hands just doing what they do with muscle memory and my unconscious calculating what to do in conjunction with my reflexes to do things I could barely follow. Thinking back on it, the Messenger just might be a perfect game, pulling off what it set out to do, providing a challenge that is tough but fair, cultivating the player's skills so that they're able to rise to meet it, and being fun all the while. So yeah, you get a recommendation, just not for the game I was originally talking about, instead for the Messenger. Cyber Shadow, though, I urge you to avoid. I was miserable the whole time. I shouted and likely disturbed my neighbors. Part of my brain reverted to an adolescent version of myself, and I was tempted to say some words I would be embarrassed to utter, and I felt violently angry and worried that I might break something. Do not play. Oh, and one last thing, Cyber Shadow. Can we get an unnecessary vehicle level that plays with a different set of rules, will never be used again, has a ton of spots for insta-death, goes on for twice as long as it should, and adds absolutely nothing to the rest of the game and the overall experience? Okay, cool. Thanks. Seriously, I knew as soon as the bike first talked to me that I was going to hate it, and I dreaded unlocking its security code so I could ride it. I don't remember if the Messenger had something like this, but if it did, it worked and it was wonderful. I can guarantee it. I also knocked out Bladed Fury by Next and PM Studios. In it, you play as G, a woman who is accused of murder, so she goes around killing people to prove her innocence. Okay, it's a bit more complicated than that. G is the daughter of a Chinese duke and is accused of killing her father. Her sister is then taken to be married by the one who framed her, so she travels around, searching for witnesses to clear her name, rescue her sister, and clear the corruption from among the Chinese lords. The game is a hack and slash. You have a fast and a heavy attack, can jump and dodge, have a shield and parry to reflect projectiles, have equipable summons, and a limited number of heals. As you down enemies, you get some health back, as well as points you can use to unlock and upgrade your abilities. And yeah, that's the long and short of things. You hack, you slash, you go to the end of the stage and fight the boss. And I had fun. I played on normal, and the game was pretty easy on that setting. I died surprisingly little and was just able to enjoy some button mashing. I had a few combos that I particularly liked that I got through the game by largely spamming, but when I did experiment, I could do some moves that looked really cool and were super satisfying to pull off. The game reminded me a good bit of Muramasa the Demon Blade, with both the gameplay and art style, despite the other being clearly Japanese as opposed to Chinese here. On that note, I'd highly recommend both games, assuming that you're not the type to take yourself too seriously and view hack and slashes as mindless. While I do find this game legitimately fun, there are two issues I feel I should bring up. First, there are some performance problems, at least on Switch. Other consoles might work better. I know other games have had more issues on Switch than elsewhere, but there were some points where things would appear to pause for a split second, then skip forward to where the action would have been without the interruption. Then, worse still, after I beat the final boss, I was given some dialogue, after which, the screen went blank as it tried to load the final cutscene, only to say stuck there while playing background music. I checked the full playthrough to see what I missed, and luckily there was no more gameplay afterwards, only one more scene and then the credit. I was worried for a moment though. Second, the game is pretty short, only taking a few hours to beat. If you buy it digital, it's $20, which doesn't seem too outlandish, but if you get it physical, then it's $30, because Switch tax, which is a bit much. However, this version does come with the soundtrack download, and if you have the game card, you won't lose access to it if the eShop gets shut down, DSWU. Plus, beating the game once gets you hard in challenge modes, so there is replayability, which luckily I still got despite the freeze. That might offset the short runtime, but at this point, I've given my opinion, so it's up for you to decide. Not that my word has ever been law. And lastly, I finished the book Jam by Benjamin Yahtzee Croshaw. In it, the residents of an Australian city wake up to find the ground covered in a flesh-eating, red, gelatinous material which smells vaguely of strawberries, which they refer to as jam. Most of the population has been wiped out, and the survivors must navigate the rooftop to find supplies and stay alive in a high-stakes game of The Floor is Lava. It's a bit of a unique take on an end-of-the-world scenario. In the book by Yahtzee I previously read, Differently Morphous, the characters were very flawed, which is also on display here. However, in Differently Morphous, they seemed more quirky and likable, but here they come off as more annoying than anything. They just seem so much more one-note. Sure, there is some character development, and some of the stupid things they obsess over are shown to be more coping mechanisms than anything, but for the most part, I didn't really care whether they lived or died, with the exception of maybe two. I find it hard to put into words why I was fine with it previously, but didn't like the imperfect characters here. Maybe it's because Differently Morphous came out after Jam, so Yahtzee probably did just get naturally better at writing. Or maybe it was because in the other book, the flaws were more, like I said, quirky, whereas here, they all seem to be different forms of selfishness, other than the main character who has no personality at all. I don't know, it was an amusing read and I didn't hate it. If you could only read one book from this author though, this would not be the one I recommend. And that'll do it. There were some good times, some bad times, some mad times, all not necessarily in that order. Thanks for watching, maybe subscribe if you enjoy this sort of thing, and perhaps I'll see you next week.